over the next 4 weeks, the lectionary shifts away from the Gospel of Matthew to the Gospel of John. So before we begin today, I want to remind you that John uses imagery of light and darkness throughout this Gospel. They are metaphors for faith and unbelief, sight and blindness. So between now and Palm Sunday, we're going to hear 4 stories from the Gospel of John. This week, we hear about the meeting between Nicodemus and Jesus. Next week, we're going to be reading about the Samaritan woman at the well. On the 4th Sunday in Lent is the story of the man born blind. And finally, we hear the story of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Each of these encounters begins with Jesus with some sort of confusion that needs to be clarified. And in each of these meetings, the person has assumptions about who Jesus is, life it is that Jesus is inviting them into, and what God is doing in the world. So today we heard the story of Nicodemus, who comes in the dark to see Jesus. And remember, darkness is a metaphor for unbelief and blindness. But clearly he is curious about Jesus. He's very sure of himself. After all, he's a respected religious leader and teacher to the Jewish people. Nicodemus would have experienced the presence of God in the temple, and so he comes to see Jesus with his knowledge and his experience to try and sort out who Jesus is. He assumes that Jesus has come from God because of the signs Jesus had performed earlier at the Passover festival in Jerusalem. And this is where he begins his inquiry with Jesus. He says, I know that you're from God because no one could do these signs without having been sent from God. But this is only a partial truth. God is present with Jesus, but Jesus is the very presence of God. And Nicodemus' knowledge and experience, they obscure his ability to see the truth, and they leave him blind to the reality that Jesus is indeed the very presence of God. Now, it says several times in this reading, Jesus answered him. And I don't really think they were much of answers, not the kind of answers that Nicodemus was looking for anyway. He's thrown off balance by each response from Jesus. No clarifications here, only more confusion. And he reveals his confusion when he asks, how can anyone be born after having grown old? He has this very literal understanding of Jesus' words. And it keeps him from even opening to any sort of different possibility than what he already knows. It keeps him from understanding what Jesus means by being born from above or being born of water and spirit. He never seems to grasp that Jesus is not speaking of worldly things. Jesus is inviting Nicodemus into a new way of seeing, to leave behind his preconceived notions and open himself to a more expansive understanding of God's presence in the world. God is not confined to the temple. Jesus is revealing God's love to Nicodemus and inviting him into deeper relationship, to experience God's unconditional love. Jesus is inviting Nicodemus into a life defined by his relationship with God, a relationship that embodies the love of God. It embodies divine love. Now, being in a relationship with God means more than following the rules and saying the right things at the right times. It means more than showing up here for worship on Sunday mornings. Like Nicodemus, Jesus invites us to leave behind our preconceived notions and open ourselves up to something new. To become born from above through water and spirit and be part of God's mission of divine love in the world. Being born of water and spirit is beyond our human logic, and it is out of reach of our human striving. We need to let go of what we think we know and be open to experiencing something different. Birth from above happens through the Holy Spirit's work of faith. We are not in charge of creating faith. Faith is created by the Holy Spirit. I don't know about you, but I find that to be a huge burden lifted, that we can depend on the Spirit. Being born of water and spirit is a mystery, and at the same time, it becomes a reality. The activity of the Spirit, like the wind, is the invisible moving the visible. We don't know from where it comes or where it goes. We can't explain it or quantify it or predict it. Through the work of the Holy Spirit, Jesus heals our brokenness and opens the way to authentic relationship with God. Christ invites us to live authentic lives grounded in relationship with God. The Spirit moves among us and draws us out of our darkness into light, from unbelief to belief, from blindness into sight. The Spirit's creative power transforms us, and through faith, we feel the embrace of divine love. Our lives are transformed, and we discover that a life of faith brings a new kind of freedom. A freedom that comes with a joy and peace that is not shaken by the circumstances in our lives. We discover a hope that sustains us even when we experience things that would otherwise defeat us. Jesus reveals God's radical, expansive love for us. And when we are loved this completely, this fully, then we are able to respond in love. The Spirit enables us to live out of Christ's love that is within us. Christ's love within us is the source of our ability to love other people the same way that Christ loves us. Once we realize that we have been loved unconditionally, we can respond from love and we honor God, sharing the good news of God's love for the world with everyone we meet. In the story of Nicodemus, we discover and encounter an unfinished person of faith. He's trying desperately to be open and to understand what God might be up to in Jesus. We too are unfinished persons of faith who are often trying desperately to understand what in the world God is up to. We wonder if Jesus really is the presence of God and what kind of life it is that Jesus is inviting us into. We feel incapable of following Jesus under the pressures of the world that oppose God. We struggle to trust God's love for us. And we struggle to trust that God's love is for all people. Jesus meets us in our humanness, in our wondering, in our questions. Jesus meets us in our misunderstandings and gazes on us with eyes full of compassion and love. You are not alone. You are loved. And Jesus sends the Spirit to remind us of that and to transform us. And to that I say, come, Holy Spirit.